Jerome Denis is an associate professor at Telecom Paris Tech and explores the manufacture and the maintenance of different kinds of information infrastructures. And his graduate student is Samuel Goeta, and he's in the PhD writing phase of his project. And he's researching political aspects of digital technology. Please welcome Jerome and Samuel.
I would like to thank the organizing team for a very warm welcome, either from the Goeta Institute, the Center for New Media, and the French Consulate. Today we're going to talk about open data and the invisible work it requires to manufacture transparency. Since 2007, the notion of open data has become a popular catchphrase to promise a renewal of transparency policies. A series of principles have been defined by activists and public figures such as Harvard law professor Lawrence Lessig. So we can see him here in 2007, not so far from here in Sebastopol, California, defining the open government data principles. Other figures I can mention is Tim Berners-Lee. He's the founder of the web. And in 2009, in a TED Talk, he asked citizens to claim access to the raw data now. Instead of looking at all these principles or their evolution very closely, we will summarize this principle in three main demands. They ask that public data should be, first, released proactively. They consider that accountability and transparency systems, such as the Freedom of Information Act itself, all systems of reactive disclosure. A question has to be asked before an answer is given. What the open government data principle asks is quite the opposite, is that data should be published proactively before it is asked for. The second demand of the open government data principle is that data should be open. That sounds quite obvious, but the open government data principle derives from the free and open source movement, as it demands that data should be published with open licenses that allow anyone legally to use the data for any purposes, and with open formats whose specifications are commonly owned and shared publicly. And the third demand is that data should be raw. Data should be published according to the open government data principles in its unmodified and unaggregated form. For transparency policies, that means that it will reduce the frictions that it requires to open the data, and also that it will reduce the information asymmetries between the citizen and administration. So, on the paper, doing transparency through open government data looks like a straightforward operation. Data-driven transparency sounds like an almost costless policy. Yet, we know from science studies that the release and the circulation of dataset is nothing but simple. There are always what Edwards and his colleagues termed data frictions. Some work is always needed. This is what we wanted to investigate through a 3-year ethnographic inquiry in various French and international administration. We observed and interviewed data managers, open data project managers, and data producers to understand the backroom work of open data. This inquiry allowed us to foreground 3 main processes through which open data is actually produced on a daily basis. The first one is identification, the second one is extraction, and the third one is transformation. Today we'll briefly present the 2 first and explain in more detail how data is transformed to understand the tension that people involved in open data projects face when concretely dealing with the principle I just presented. So first, data have to be identified. Identification has become a crucial feature of open data policies. In the US, it is notably the case since the 2013 White House executive orders, which requires each federal administration to create and maintain an exhaustive data inventory. Identifying data seems a very simple process. We can imagine that people we'll only have to gather existing data and discuss later its technical and political openability. Actually, it is a very sensitive operation. For in a lot of cases, people do not know what kind of data exists in their administration. Identification takes a whole process of exploration and negotiation within the departments where files, documents, pieces of information are not only identified but progressively instantiated as data. Once the data candidate to opening are identified, people still have to grasp them, which is, again, not a self-evident matter. Data is generally encapsulated in databases that are not designed to release a bulk extract of raw data. In such configuration, data managers struggle with these databases and sometimes with the providers. They delve beyond visualization interfaces in the guts of hard drive at the roots of databases, developing custom-made extraction tools that finally allow them to handle data itself. These two first operations show that raw data is not naturally available in administration and that transparency does not rhyme with immediacy. It also shows the complexity of the social technical network government data is part of. Identification and extraction show that people invested in open data projects have to concretely disarticulate the socio-technical assemblages that hold original data together. Beyond these two operations, data manager also transforms data itself. A first transformation occurs when they proceed to data cleaning. Cleaning means several things. It can be correcting mistakes, filling the blanks, but also harmonizing the data. For instance, I will talk about one example, which is election data. We would expect that these data are often disseminated, but actually we observe that these data must be harmonized as each ballot brings new categories, new names of political parties, for instance. And the files are structured differently with a different order of columns for each election. These differences between all the election data set become a problem as automated scripts require consistent categories and structuration of the files. This process aims at avoiding the release of what could be considered as bad quality data, which could thereafter reflect on the image of the government department. Also, to foster the usability of data set by developers, the open data principle requires the use of open standards. One of them has become the norm for opening data. It's CSV. CSV stands as comma-separated value. It's a very simple text format in which values are separated by commas and rows by line drops. So within administration, spreadsheet is still the norm for producing, maintaining, and circulating government information. So think about the spreadsheet file that you maintain in your hard drive. They often contain information in the form of a bold text called background or merged cells. The CSV specifications are usually not compatible with the file we daily use, as they're merely using the save as feature of the spreadsheet software loses much of the information contained in these files and often creates nonsensical data set. Thus, this formatting operation requires particular care by data managers.
Actually, these various operations foreground a very particular problem that data managers and all the people in charge of open data projects face. The need to release intelligible data. That is, data that are understandable and more generally usable by everyone. Such obligation is notably explicitly inscribed, as you can see it, in the principles of the 2013 J8 Open Data Charter. The problem is, of course, that even once they are identified and extracted, most of government data are not naturally understandable. They appear in very heterogeneous shapes and are full of idiosyncrasies. Making them intelligible is an operation of its own, especially because, in fact, data managers have to perform two kinds of intelligibility. One dedicated to machines, and another dedicated to humans. These two intelligibilities raise specific issues. So first, as you can see again here in the J8 charter, there is a clear demand for what is called machine-readable data. What is the point here? Emphasizing the idea of that data should be easily understood by machines is a way to foster transparency for innovation and to equip the developers and their tools. This very notion of machine-readable data draws actually on an ideal of information fluidity in which transparency occurs almost mechanically in a machine-to-machine communication. As Samuel just told, the concrete realization of such an ideal raises many difficulties. First, people have to struggle with the heterogeneity of standards. There are no such thing as a set of once and for all defined standards for every open data project. And second, most of all, for it may modify and even corrupt the data, every formatting operation has to be taken very carefully. The second intelligibility issue concerns the general public. Mundane people should also understand what government data are about. From this side of data intelligibility, transparency is very different and directly concerns the content of the files and the documents. Indeed, government data are professional data, the signification of which is somehow complex and is grounded in uses, in internal uses. They are made of acronyms, ambiguous entities, specialized categories. Therefore, a lot of transformations consist in struggling against these idiosyncrasies. Here, the difficulties are multiple. First, a balance has to be made between transforming the data and providing metadata that would explain what the data mean. But second, data managers actually concretely deal with the non-transparency of language itself. Even with tons of metadata, data cannot be completely exhaustively significant, of course. This is what Edwards, again, and his colleagues showed in Science. Beyond extensive metadata sets, people who exchange very specialized scientific data still have to talk to each other in order to adjust their understanding. And finally, there is an even more complex issue. For what kind of users exactly should the data be understandable? Scholars, journalists, young people, old ones, ethnic minorities, and who knows, do not ask the same kind of vocabulary, the same level of precision, and so forth. Making data understandable by all is a complex and somehow always failing process that requires choices and a certain amount of knowledge from data managers. Choices that are not always explicitly political in a strict term, but that do always perform a specific reality. To conclude, we should insist on the paradox that the people in charge of open data projects have to deal with. As Samuel explained it earlier, the release of raw data, that is, data in their unmodified form, is an important feature of open data policies. But as we just saw, original data are rarely understandable and intelligible data. Intelligibility requires modification. So we could conclude that after what we briefly exposed here, raw data are an illusion, that they do not really exist. But actually, this would be another simplification. An interesting finding of our ethnographic study lies in the notion that some open data people use to explain their work. Indeed, they consider that most of the cleaning and formatting operations they accomplish are part of what they call a rawification process. What does that mean? It means that since the professional data they deal with are situated, grounded, full of features made for specific users within the administrations, they have to unground them in a way. By cleaning and formatting, they try to erase all traces of previous uses. This idea of rawification highlights an important aspect of the manufacture of data-driven transparency, which, as we saw, has nothing to do with immediacy, of course. Data are not naturally fluid commodity, and their production and circulation takes work. They have to be instantiated. What we try to show here is that beyond all the explicitly political choices that are made, of course, in open data policies, data instantiation also draws on more mundane socio-technical work that remains largely invisible precisely because the release of raw data is generally thought as a mechanical, almost costless process. Daily, actually, the people in charge of open data projects have to deal concretely with what Boker or Gitelman called the oxymoron of raw data. Their work consists in carefully cooking what progressively become raw data. Thank you.